Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. I want to thank you for being here today. I'm Dr. Amanda Reed. I teach the media law classes here at the J School, and I'm also faculty co-director for the Center for Media Law and Policy, and First Amendment Day is one of our signature events. This is our 16th annual First Amendment Day. It means we've been doing this for a decade and a half plus, and this is a tradition that calls us together to reflect on freedoms that are essential to our democracy. And they are as essential as they are fragile in practice. They are the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, and to petition for the government for redress of grievances. This day is more than just a symbolic gesture. It's a concrete reminder that freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment are not static relics, but rather living commitments that must be defended and renewed with each generation. Thank you, next generation, for being here. This panel, What's at Stake, directly addresses the central questions of our time. Can our institutions survive without robust protections for dissent, protest, and press? If democracy depends on the First Amendment, what happens when those freedoms are weakened? To help us explore these questions and more, I'm thrilled to present our esteemed colleagues, three of them at the J School here, Dr. Meredith Clark, Dr. Shannon McGregor, and Dr. Daniel Kreis, all principal co-investigators with the university's Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And we're also very fortunate to have a very special guest, Anika Collier, a lawyer, assistant professor of professional practice at Columbia Journalism School, and reporting fellow of Tech Policy Press. Dr. Kreis, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. So as Amanda said, I'm Daniel Kreis. I'm the faculty director of the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life. We're a center on campus that conducts research to create more fair, free, equal, and just media and technological systems. And our work holds powerful media, technology, and political elites to account in the service of democracy. I just want to say a few framing words, and then I'm going to move off stage and hand things over to my three colleagues here. Where I want to start is where Amanda started us today. The First Amendment is central to democratic accountability because it protects us from the tyranny of government and those in charge of it. With a president determined to force the country to bend to his will, to force Americans to learn his whitewashed version of history, to force us to sanctify his ideological martyrs, to force us to toe the line and to line his family's pockets from the public's coffers, and to force us to live by the rules of his God above all others. The First Amendment is one of the last bulwarks we have against tyranny. The First Amendment protects our liberty and it protects our freedom. It protects our speech, the press's speech, the expressions of our great faiths, and yes, even the rights of platforms to create spaces for democratic debate and discussion free of violence and harassment and hate. It protects all of us from the government. And we live under a current government that's sliding towards authoritarianism. We have a president and an administration and a party that is rapidly dismantling the checks on their power. The accountability that comes from free and fair elections, the accountability that comes from independent regulatory agencies and an independent Department of Justice, the accountability that comes from the political opposition, the accountability that comes from comedians and universities and journalists and public opinion itself, and the democratic checks on power that the platforms where we conduct much of our political, commercial, social, and entertainment lives, the democratic checks that they can exercise but too often fail to do so, which we'll hear later about today. We are living right now through a crisis of democratic accountability in the United States. But we also still have a First Amendment. That First Amendment protects our rights, our universities' rights, our journalists' rights, and our platforms' rights to speak in the name and the voice and the interests of the public, to speak with, for, and from the public, to hold those who would divide us, those who would profit from us, those who would scam us, those who would threaten us, those who would demean us, those who would deport us, and those who would steal our elections accountable. And thankfully, the First Amendment also protects the voices of these three brilliant women who are gathered here to show us how to be resilient at a time of democratic threats. And with that, I will hand things off to my colleague, Meredith Clark, who's an associate professor of race and political communication here and a co-principal investigator with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life.
Daniel Crease is always a very tough act to follow, and I curse having C as the beginning of my last name, which is usually how this works. So I'm going to pick up with the question that is the title of our panel, what's at stake? When I thought about this question, it occurred to me a couple of times that there are some things that we need to assess in our history as we look forward to folks thinking about the midterm elections, thinking about the future of the country, thinking about the First Amendment. And so I want to start with a point. I've got 2 points for you, one about journalism's role and the other one about some of the constraints that journalism has struggled with in recent years. So what's at stake? What's at stake is the danger of reviving lost cause narratives in the 21st century. We're battling a memory hole that prompts us to think about the 2026 midterms and subsequent elections as new threats rather than the extension of a problem that our ancestors faced in the Reconstruction years. Ultimately, it is a threat of functionally withdrawing access to the meaningful vote from anyone who is not white, male, and wealthy enough to be able to show up on a single election day in order to cast their ballot, hopefully within a district in which it will actually count. What's at stake is forgetting about the centrality of the South. If you had the opportunity to hear our CTAP colleague, Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, speak when she accepted the Wolf Award last week, you will be reminded that everything about progress in this country runs through the South. In the foreword, the book, Journalism and Jim Crow, White Supremacy and the Black Struggle for a New America, the author writes, of the many institutions that made the New South what it was, the sheriff's office, the magistrate's court, the all-white jury, the plantation, the mill, the segregated streetcar, the convict coal mine, the railroad, the peonage camp, the ballot box, the rope on the tree, the white caps and the red shirts, the Democratic Party, the merchant store, the county chain gang, the county courthouse, the Confederate monument standing in front of that courthouse, and the Daughters of the Confederacy chapter that put it there, the press must be considered as an integral part of the fabric of white supremacy as much as any of these. So we must consider the historical shortcomings of the press that have brought us to this moment yet again, wherein news organizations failed to label the January 6th insurrection for what it was, a treasonous attack on the electoral process as a central mechanism in the construction and maintenance of our liberal democracy. May I remind you that Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution states that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses of the same overt act or on confession in open court. In the Marshall Court, Justice Marshall wrote, if a body of men be actually assembled for the purpose of effecting by force a treasonable purpose, all of those who perform any part, however minute or however remote from the scene of the action, and who are actually leagued in the general conspiracy, are to be considered as traitors. Millions of us witnessed the effecting by force of the treasonable purpose to overturn the results of the election. Yet the news media has refused to name it, because what is at stake for the oligarchs who now control most of our powerful media institutions is the potential, real or imagined, to profit. That leads me to my second point. Profit motives, what's at stake is how profit motives and corporate consolidation threaten journalism's function within a liberal democracy. News media is reluctant to name illiberal acts such as the introduction of punitive race-based policies as racism and the open assault of the electoral process as treason, because in moving from a vocation to an occupation over the course of the 20th century, journalism became a commercial enterprise that used its First Amendment rights as privileged protection that the free market incentivizes in terms of consolidation and conglomeration. These business imperatives are at odds with what legal scholar Marianne Franks calls fearless speech. That is, speech that privileges the perspectives of those who are most vulnerable in our societies. While news and media outlets may have once been legally protected from censorship, as we have seen in recent weeks, they are subject to more sensitive and regulating force, consumer choice. Problems of restricted access in the form of paywalls and the evolution, or as Cory Doctorow might say, the enshittification of news as content, has underscored the bilateral problem of having ignored and marginalized diverse communities who feel now no responsibility to pay for coverage that insults and mischaracterize them, and the inability to retain and attract readers within the narrowly defined concept of the public, which in practice, we must admit, is still thought of as wholly white, male, and or beholden to patriarchal influence, and wealthy enough to have disposable income that they are willing to spend on journalism. But goodwill, as we have seen, from the imperative to diversify our news force to the imperatives that govern our campuses, are simply not enough. Thus, what's at stake when we forget about editorial complicity in framing democracy as a racially and economically exclusive project by failing to provide language to call racism what it is and to call treason what it is linking our fate to the fickle free market and linking the news media system that positions canceling of a millionaire comedian as the marker of censorship rather than the suppression of a true diversity of ideas in college classrooms and in the bully pulpits of the press. We think about this in the case of Karen Attiah, the Washington Post reporter, or opinion columnist, I should say, who was silenced a few weeks ago for simply quoting a controversial figure in his own words. We think about this in terms of the warnings from people on the margins who tried to tell us that their communities deserved fair coverage. What's at stake is the abstract threat of civic ignorance being leveraged for tangible outcomes. That is, the strategies to gerrymander districts, limit polling places and hours, burden eligible voters with unconstitutional ID requirements, all via a lack of media literacy that has complicated the average citizen's ability to parse the motives of bills that purport to uphold free and fair elections, yet do the exact opposite. What is at stake is our conception of what journalism is, can, and should be. We talk about journalism as a calling, a constitutionally protected vocation or occupation, but not as a commercial good. If goodwill were enough, if good were at the center of human nature and political will, we would not have a need for an event such as this one to commemorate the First Amendment while we acknowledge the ongoing threats to its scope. At the center of the concept that I call reparative journalism, I argue that we need to consider journalism as a model that weighs the influence of constitutional freedom and responsibility alongside the roles of public service vocations and on the foundation of profit motives to champion a reparative approach as a tool for teaching, developing, and producing news media with pro-democracy imperatives. I look forward to speaking with you about my third key point, and that is limits or remedies to organized resistance for journalism in the 21st century.
Thank you, Meredith, for that. I feel like what you said, and I have to come after you, and you had to come after Daniel. So I'm excited to be here and talk with you all. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Daniel called the democratic checks that platforms can exercise or that they should exercise. And I'm going to do that by telling you a little bit about myself and some things that I went through and experienced firsthand. But before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about being here 16 years ago. It seems crazy, but as you all said, like this is the 16th First Amendment Day. And the very first one, I was a 1L right over at the law school, way too excited. And I had taken what was called a media law class. Any of y'all taken a media law class? Absolutely. So I majored in journalism in undergrad. I took a media law class and that was my shit, y'all. Like, excuse my language, but like I really found my space where I was like, oh my gosh, this is the place where I can think about all of these big ideas. I can think about speech. I can think about rights. I can think about the internet, right? This was a time when social media was brand new, y'all, right? So like Twitter was brand new. Instagram was like brand new when I was out here in the law school streets and having a good time. And so it was this brand new world that I was like determined to be a part of. And so I came here and was like, I'm going to be a media lawyer. I'm so determined. I'm going to be doing this thing. And so I'm so excited to be back here 16 years later to be able to talk about some of the work that I actually was able to accomplish as somebody who sat in one of these seats and thought like, please universe, like I really want to go out and I want to practice media law and policy. That was just the thing that I wanted to do. I had no idea what that meant, right? It was words. It was like, there's something out here. There's something that I want to do. And the reality is, and I want to tell you all this, especially all of you students, and I want you to hear me on this. When I was out here looking for jobs, so I left, let me stop and say I left here. I went and got my master's degree at Columbia Journalism School. I wrote my master's thesis. It was titled "The Revolution Will Be Tweeted," right? I was like, something big is happening over here on this website. People thought I was nuts, y'all. They were like, Twitter is a place where people tell you what you ate for breakfast. Like there's no way that there's going to be a revolution on this thing, right? And I was like, I'm telling y'all, like there's really something happening here. And the reality was I wanted to be a part of it. I was like, I want to be one of these people who's going to be a part of deciding like, you know, who's going to decide like what speech is allowed and what speech isn't allowed. And the reality was that didn't yet exist, right? The thing that I ended up working in, the field that I ended up working in did not yet exist when I graduated. And so I had to wait, right? The technology literally like was not there yet. And so I had to wait for it to catch up. And so I want to share that with all of you all who are interested in thinking about these things and thinking about technology and thinking about First Amendment and recognizing that these intersections that you might be obsessed with right now, the job literally might not yet exist, right? So like, remember that as you go out into the field. I am proof that you can come back 16 years later and be like, the job really did exist, right? It took a little while, but you get there, right? And so what I had to do is I took some jobs. Like I took some jobs working at law firms, doing some communications, doing some business development, paying the bills, until a think tank opened. And this brand new think tank called Data and Society Research Institute opened. And they had this new position that was called Big Data. Does anybody remember Big Data? No. Oh, Lord. Okay. So back before we had these things called AI, we used to call it big data, right? So it was so much data that it was big data. And now it's artificial intelligence, right? It's all just the same name for the whole thing, right? So we had this thing called big data and civil rights. And so I started leading up that work. Fairness was this new concept. Y'all have heard of fairness? And yes, yeah, okay. So y'all have heard of some of these things. Okay. So fairness was like the brand new term. So we were talking about, you know, these new things with machine learning and like, what are we going to do here? And I was like, okay, I'm on my pathway, right? I finally figured it out. I'm starting to get this work. I'm starting to be able to do this thing when it comes to speech and technology, and started thinking about the internet and was still really paying attention to the social media and figuring out what's going on. So I ended up working at an advocacy organization next, and ended up going, one of my jobs was literally to go into Twitter and to be like, your policies suck, right? They are awful. They are terrible. They are the worst that I've ever seen. And you all really need to change them. And I remember sitting there and the person who was in charge looked at me and said like, okay, great. So like, what would you do to change them? And I was like, ooh, good question, right? Like, that's a really great question. I'm just kind of stuck on like, they're terrible, right? Like I hadn't really thought about like the other piece of this. And that's when I realized I had no idea how the machine worked, right? Like I had no idea how Twitter actually operated. I had no idea when I say the policies are terrible, like what does that mean? How do I fix it? What lever can I pull to make something happen? What lever can I pull to make change? What is actually going on here? And that's stuck in the back of my mind. And I was like, I did not like that, right? I did not like the fact that I did not have the answer and I could not figure out how to do this thing. Well, turns out I went and taught high school for a year. And then a couple months later, I ended up getting recruited by that same person that I had that conversation with at Twitter to go and start working at Twitter. And so I worked at Twitter in what's called the Trust and Safety Department. Who's heard of Trust and Safety? Yeah, all right. This again, trust and safety. If I would have said those words 16 years ago, y'all would have been like, I would have been like, never heard of it, like not a real thing. Like this is how far we've come, right? Like we have a whole industry that like y'all can raise your hand and say that it exists and that like it really is a thing. I've worked in it. I promise it's real. So I ended up working in trust and safety, working what's called safety policy. For those of you all who have not heard of these things. So the way that I describe this is you think of every social media company, every platform as its own little country, right? It's its own little world, and all of its users are its own citizens of its own little country. And the trust and safety department and the policy department, we are the government, right? We are the folks who write the rules and can say what you can say, what you cannot do, what you're gonna get in trouble for, how you're gonna get in trouble, what's gonna happen. And the only thing is that none of us were elected. And the majority of people have no idea that we even exist, right? So like, not really the best kind of government, I would say, not really the best sort of setup. And so when I showed up to the job, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. Again, be careful what you ask for. And I genuinely was like, this job should not exist, right? I sat down and I was like, once I finally realized that the job was not going to be sitting down and just writing policies, and really what the job was every single day dealing with social political issues and making sure that people stayed alive and doing that by writing documents, I was like, oh my God, like people don't know that we're sitting here and we're doing this. People don't know that every single day. All you would see was just the news articles that said, you know, today on Twitter, so-and-so said such and such, and that got them in trouble for this thing, right? And that's what I would spend my every single day on, right? And it was just this honestly intoxicating job, right? This like, especially as someone who's trained as like a journalist and a lawyer, right? Like to be in the middle of the action, to know that whatever I did today was going to be like leading the New York Times as soon as I hit send, right? Crazy sort of day. So much power that we had in our hands. And at the time I was hired specifically as the free expression expert, right? That's what I do. That's what I went here to do. That's what I wouldn't stop doing. I didn't mention that when I was in the journalism school. I would not stop taking every single First Amendment and media law class that I could get my hand on. Professor Ardia can guarantee that. I also work for the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy, y'all. Like this was really like, this was my stuff, right? So I finally am here at Twitter. I am the free expression expert. So that means that anything policy related, anybody says anything on the platform, we're deciding like, are you gonna get in trouble? Is what you said against our rules? I am the person who is giving the advice, giving the expertise to this platform that is driving global communication at this time. This was 2019. I don't know if y'all can remember back before 2019 because the world was different, right? So, but it was 2019 and this was what I was in the midst of doing come 2020. So we all, sure we all remember 2020. The first week of 2020, I will never forget because I was sitting minding my own business in a meeting with my team, and my boss walks into the room, sits down, looks at me and says, hey, can you make sure that World War III doesn't start on our platform today? Right. And I was like, whoa, okay, like who can I call, right? Like, do I get to call like the UN? Like, is there somebody that like, you know what I mean? Like, what am I doing? Like, I am the free expression expert, right? Like, I'm not a foreign diplomat. Like, I don't know how to end a war. I don't know how to start a war, right? Like, I just don't really know much about this. And my boss was like, you have 48 hours. And so me and my team got to work, right? And we sat down and we started thinking about the logistics of information warfare and thinking about what do we do on this platform that we can allow. At the time, you know, Donald Trump was threatening to bomb cultural sites in Iran, and I think the Ayatollah was calling for the like bounty on the heads of American soldiers. So like it was really tense, y'all, right? And so it's like, okay, both of these folks have like nuke buttons, and so what do we do on this platform so that we can allow these folks to what we called saber rattle, right? Like crazy name for like, please don't kill all of us, right? How do we allow them to do this thing while then recognizing and allowing allowing the information to continue such that like the bombs don't actually go off, right? So that was that was the first week of 2020. And I think back on that and I tell you all that story because I realized that was the week I should have known everything was going to be going downhill for the rest of the year, right? Because it surely did, right? Like we had no time off, we had no break, and things just continued to escalate in 2020. As I'm sure you all remember, a couple of months later, we end up with the COVID pandemic, right? And so I'm sitting working at Twitter, and we have these new things called labels. Y'all know labels? Have you all seen labels on social media before? Those little things that are like, this breaks our rules, but we've decided that we're going to keep it up because we think this person is really important, right? I think my team developed those. The world is welcome. That is something that we contributed to society. And to say, before we did that, the only options that we used to have was either to keep something up or take it down, right? There's literally nothing else that we could do. It was like either you keep the tweet up or you take it down. And now we had the option to label. That made a lot of people upset, right? And so we started changing the way that content moderation was done historically. And so you have this thing, you have this pandemic that has hit the United States, you have a lot of uncertainty to begin with, right? And then you have this company who is doing this brand new thing that no one has ever seen them done before, and it looks like a little bit of overreach, or it looks like something strange, or it looks like something that, again, we've never seen before. And so the conversation on the platform kind of started to change, right? We see these folks who are starting to call for protests. And I remember one of the conversations as the free expression expert, me, myself, and I getting into and fighting to the death with people on was, people wanted to protest mask mandates, right? And Twitter was of the mind, like, this is a public health crisis. We can't protest them. If people are calling for protests, they're not supposed to be gathered. We'll take those down. And here I come like, hey, so people fundamentally have the right to gather and assemble and protest against their government. Like that's like literally what the words of the First Amendment say. And so like we can't start taking these things down, right? And I say that because that was the job. The job wasn't like what I personally think, right? Like I was not personally going out and protesting mask mandate. Like I was at home masked up, like 3 masks, like I'm a germaphobe. Like that was not me. But will I fight for the right for somebody else to go out there and protest and do whatever they think that they need to do? Absolutely, right? And so the job, so much, I say one of my most common things that I used to say was, I don't love it, right? Like I'd see something and it'd be like, okay, Nika, like what are we gonna do? I don't love it, right? And that was my way of saying like, I wouldn't say that, right? Like I probably wouldn't be friends with somebody who says that thing. But like, is it against our rules? No. So will I now make the argument that this should stay and that this person should be allowed to say that thing? Absolutely. So this is the mindset I'm going into COVID 2020. And we've kind of started to see this like undercurrent of a conversation happening that is, we should violently overthrow the government, right? Okay, so the government is, doing these mask mandates and we don't really like them. And so like, the common, like kind of most common language is like, we'll protest, we'll be upset, we'll get mad. But again, right there on the underlying was like, actually what we should do is we're armed and we should probably make sure that we overthrow the government in a very violent way. I saw that, started to concern me, right? This is the beginning of 2020. It was like, okay, but as people who know, as long as the internet has been around, people have been calling for a second civil war, right? Like this is just part of internet culture. It is part of internet lore. It has always been there, right? So it's like, okay, I'll just kind of keep this in the back of my mind, start paying attention, see what's happening here. 2020 progresses. We have George Floyd who is killed, and then we have the BLM protests that happen, right? And we see that those protests turn violent and people end up dying at protests, right? And so now we have this undercurrent again of this language that is saying that we should overthrow the government, but violently this time, because there's these protests that are happening and there's continuing to happen. And so this conversation is getting louder and louder and louder. And I'm watching as it's happening and I'm taking notes and recognizing like, hey, this seems to be bad, right? Like this is no longer just an undercurrent here, but this seems to be becoming a dominant narrative that I see happening on the platform. And that continued and kept going. And then, we have the election that happens in November. As we all know what happened with the election, and Donald Trump came onto Twitter and decided that he was going to not concede the election, right? And so we end up in this moment in which now we have folks who are saying, who have been willing and wanting to violently overthrow the government, actually saying, well, we have like a real reason now, right? Like the election has been stolen and therefore we need to make this thing right. And so at this point, I've been making, notes and taking all kinds of, notes and doing what I need to do. And I had raised this, these comments and my sort of concerns to my bosses a couple of different times. And starting around, October, November, it became really urgent. And I kept saying, hey, this is really bad, right? Like people are really sitting here on the platform and they're really talking about wanting to do actual violence. And from, I took media law, right? I took First Amendment, like I'd seen incitement to violence. It's looking a little bit like that, right? But it's not as blatant as you would want it to be, right? It's not, people are using hashtags and they're saying, I'm hashtag locked and loaded and ready for this American Civil War Part 2 to start, right? Or another big hashtag was stand back, stand by, which was something that Donald Trump said to the Proud Boys at a debate, which was, I told Congress, like, was the first time we saw the president giving a directive directly to a domestic violence organization, not domestic violence, domestic terrorist organization, right? And like these directives were being listened to. So we come to November, we see all of this that's going on the platform, and I start begging my bosses, can we please do something? Can we please write a policy? Can we please start taking this down? Because I have a feeling that something really bad is about to happen. And what I wanted to do was start putting, water on the fire. And what was actually happening is we were putting gasoline on the fire, right? So I was told no, I was told absolutely not, we can't take these things down for a variety of different reasons. And I continued to, again, ask and beg and say, can we pretty please do something about this? And then comes December. We have had for months now people sitting on the platform saying, I want to do political violence. I'm ready to violently overthrow the government. I'm locked and loaded. I'm ready. And Donald Trump gets on the platform. I think it was December 19th. Don't ask me why. I still remember that date. And said, be there, will be wild, right? Hashtag January 6th. And as I told Congress, y'all are from North Carolina, so y'all will get this analogy. I do not think Congress understood what I was talking about. But I was like, it was like a barbecue, right? Like you have people who are going around saying like, I want to do a barbecue. I have my grill, I've got the charcoal, I've got the meat, like we've got the sauces, like we've got the coleslaw, like we've got the baked potato, like we're ready to go. Like, when are we going to do this coleslaw? Or not this coleslaw, when are we going to do this barbecue? And all of a sudden, like the leader of the cause is like, anybody want to do a barbecue? Will be wild, hashtag January 6th. Also, by the way, it's going to be happening at the Capitol, right? So it was like, I said it was like an RSVP, right? It was like, here's the time, here's the date, here's what we're doing. If you're interested, come on through, right? And when I saw that, I panicked and I recognized like, oh my God, this thing that I've been worrying is going to happen is not only going to happen, but like I know exactly when it is going to happen now. So that's December. I go into December, and I keep having this conversation, go in and talk to the vice president that, I had talked to all those years and months ago about this, and who had hired me to come in and be the expert to deal with this. And she kept telling me, no, we couldn't do anything about it. And no, we can't take down these tweets. And no, we can't write a policy that would be able to implement any of it. And so this kept going all the way up until January 5th, honestly. And I remember there's a Slack message that was read into Congress on the day of January 5th, where I sent a message to one of my colleagues after I had been in a meeting and asked one last time, hey, I'm really concerned. Like, I'm genuinely concerned about what's going to happen. It's on video. Like, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen tomorrow. I've been warning y'all for months. Like, I really think there's going to be violence tomorrow. Can we please do something? We're told again, like, no, you can't do anything. I sent a message to my colleagues and I'm like, hey, when people are shooting each other in the streets tomorrow, I'm going to try and rest in the knowledge that we tried, right? And like, that's how I went to bed on January 5th, was with this deep understanding that something horrific was going to happen the next day, and that there was nothing that I was going to be able to do about it, and I was not going to be able to actually do my job, and I had not been allowed to actually do my job up until that moment. So I woke up on the morning of January 6th, and I still remember I lived in New York City, I was pacing back and forth, which was like not that big because it was a New York City apartment. So I was walking back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I was just like literally waiting for something bad to happen. I was like, okay, like what's going to happen? When are they going to start shooting? Like what's going to happen? And so I ended up watching the whole thing. I didn't actually watch any of it on the news. I ended up watching the whole thing happen and play out on Twitter. And so I got up on Twitter that morning, started paying attention, get on Slack, start talking to folks. Next thing we know, we see this protest that was happening at the Ellipse. Is that what it was called, y'all? I believe so. That was happening there, start walking down to the Capitol. And the next thing we know, we see that the Capitol has been breached, right? And that people are, they are hanging gallows and calling for Mike Pence to be executed. Hashtag execute Mike Pence started trending as the #1 trending topic, which we had to deal with, of course. And so I'm sitting there watching this happen and I'm extremely frustrated because I told y'all so, right? And so I'm sitting there and I get called in finally by my boss. And I get told two different directives, like, hey, I need you to do 2 things. I'm like, what's going on again? And I say I was frustrated, but I also said to her I was frustrated. I was like, hey, I'm frustrated with you because I told you that this was going to happen. You didn't listen to me, and now you're asking me to clean it up, right? And like, that doesn't feel great. We didn't really have time for my feelings that day. Instead, I was told to do 2 different things. One was, and I quote, make the insurrection stop. Yes, again, was unprepared for the things that I was going to be asked to do on this job, y'all. And the second was, we need a reason to permanently suspend the president. So just like 2 real easy breezy, beautiful cover girl. And it was not that, right? And so I said I had a couple of hours, right? And I was like, cool, here's my notebook. I still remember sketching down this argument, right? This like free expression argument and the public interest and like blah, 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 blah. Gave it off to a colleague and was like, I need you to take this and run with this one over here. I've got to make the insurrection stop. And so I took, the document that I had been working on for all of these months that was never approved, that was called Coded Incitement to Violence, worst name. And I will say this, I say this all the time. If I would have known that all of these years later, we would still be talking about that policy, I promise y'all, I would have named it something better. Like, truly, but it was just like, whatever, it doesn't matter, like whatever. So coded incitement to violence does not roll off a tongue in any way, shape, or form. But that policy was what we ended up dusting off, ended up implementing that day. Myself and my team ended up jumping on twitter.com using the search function, looking through hashtags, and literally I described it to Congress as I felt like I was a digital security guard, like standing over the Capitol and taking down tweets. And I was like, hey, this has been breached, come through over here, tweet deleted, right? Like going and making sure that these folks were safe on the day of me and my team doing this work. Eventually, the guidance went out to the rest of the world and content moderators around the world picked it up and we were able to kind of stop doing the work and rest and relax and think a little bit about maybe what had happened that day. And then leading into January 6th and then January 8th, of course, was the day that the president was actually permanently suspended. And my team and I ended up having to write the assessment and making those arguments as well. And I think what was most amazing to me was the next week after all of that happened. The next week when we came in, one of the things that we had to start dealing with was this rumor and misinformation that was happening on the platform that was saying that the January 6th attack was not done by protesters and instead was a false flag operation that was done by the FBI. And this is one of the narratives that, as we know, is like taken over the public consciousness, right? But this happened literally less than a week after January 6th happened. And I remember sitting there and I had been following the work of Maria Ressa, who's a journalist and Rappler in the Philippines, and seeing how quickly history could be rewritten, right? And recognizing that here is a place in which martial law had literally come and killed people, right? And taken everything from folks. And it had been completely rewritten in a way in which their ancestors were begging for martial law, right? And I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, that can happen and it's going to happen here, right? And so a couple months later, I ended up getting subpoenaed by Congress because as a good lawyer, I left a paper trail. And so I was found and was subpoenaed to come in and talk to Congress in the January 6th committee as they were trying to figure out, what role social media played in the January 6th attack and all of that. And I remember one of the reasons why I ended up doing this was because, again, of that moment of recognizing how quickly history could be retold, right? And how quickly things could be erased and how quickly it could happen, and realizing that I had had a firsthand seat to all of this. And I had seen it all with my own eyes. I had taken contemporaneous notes, right? And I was one of the few people who could actually leave a record and leave a truthful record of what happened on those days and in those companies, and thinking about things like speech and thinking about things like democracy. And so I talked to Congress for a couple of different times. It's all over the internet. If you want to go watch it, have fun. It's very long and boring. I would not recommend it unless you really like C-SPAN, which, if that's what you're into, you're in the right field and in the right place. But I say that because one of the things that you mentioned, Meredith, was about how the news media wouldn't name January 6th for what it was, right? And I watched that continue to happen to the place that we are now. And so as I come here now, I talk to you all about this long story, this long narrative of everything that we could be doing, everything that happened. And we're in a different space now, right? We're in a space where Elon Musk has bought what used to be Twitter. It's no longer Twitter anymore, right? He has rolled back trust and safety at Twitter, and every single company has followed suit around the world, right? We no longer have as many folks or as many policies in place. And what I told Congress was, without people and policy, political violence is going to happen again, right? And I still very much believe that. And I still very much recognize that, as much as I said, I didn't believe those jobs should exist, right? I walked in and was like, absolutely not. Like, there's way too much power in the hands of way too few. I also recognize that we were, as Daniel said, the last bulwark against tyranny, right? In many ways, we were the folks who were the last stop, who were sitting there and had the ability to do something when it mattered. And so I want to tell all of you all who are here, who are thinking about these careers, who are thinking about what you want to do with this, interests that you might have in the First Amendment or in speech or free expression or whatever the case may be. First off, good luck. Not trying to be rude, but genuinely, very good luck, because this is it is a different time to be a part of this work, right? And I believe that it is more important now than it has ever been. And I want to encourage you all to take this information, take where I landed, because when I tell you I'm not doing this ever again, I will not ever do that again, but some of you all will, right? And I want to encourage you that while you're here, while you're in your studies, while you're doing this work, get yourself prepared, right? Get yourself ready. I didn't have when I was being told to do all kinds of crazy things at work had these huge impact, right? My brain had already had to function to think of these things. I had to think of these, it wasn't an argument that I came up with 3 seconds, right? There was a platform and there was a lot of things underneath there that I learned in these very halls that was able to be the standard and to be able to be the thing that I called up. So I encourage you all to do that, because you never know. I didn't know when the moment was happening. I remember sitting there thinking, when history looks back on this moment, who do I want to be, right? And I can tell you, I wasn't necessarily ready to meet the moment, right? But I had to. And part of that was, again, being ready and being prepared beforehand. So I encourage you all to do that, and to, when you go into this work, because it is essential and it is necessary. And unfortunately, as Meredith said, we shouldn't have to depend on the goodness of a couple of different people inside of a company to do the right thing. But that is the reality of what we have in the system that we work within. And I want to encourage you all to be those people and do that good work. So thank you.
That was great. Thank you both so much. I'm just going to ask a couple questions from up here, and then I'm going to turn it over to y'all to ask a couple questions as well. First of all, then the day that the president was suspended was then my busy day, right? For you researched politicians on Twitter, I was like, okay, and now I'm on the phone. Thank you for that. So, in thinking about, what both of you have talked about and the, responsibility of platforms to prioritize speech that moves us closer to democracy, the responsibility of, news outlets and of journalists to do the same thing, right? To voice opposition, to, voice public opinion, to hold those in power to account, right? This didn't used to be a sort of overlap, but now we have this, right? And as far as I see it, like, I'll take whoever would like to come on the side of holding our democracy strong, right? And fighting back against the oppression. So, these are the things, the responsibility and the rights of platforms and news outlets to do these things is what is actually one of the things granted them by the First Amendment, right? That the government can't tell them that they can or cannot do certain things and have certain policies. So how can we as students, how can we as people demand more from these media organizations, and what should we be demanding, right? Like, what are the redresses? What are the different types of policies or coverage? I'm trying to give you your third point here, Meredith, but, that we should be demanding. And then the other part of that is, I guess, like, when our students are in these roles, when they're working in news organizations, when they're working in media law and policy, when they're working for platforms, what can they do then, right? Like, what should they be thinking about as these North Stars of these goals that can move us closer to democracy instead of away from democracy, which is the direction not only our country is moving, but also, as both of you have pointed out, what we also see happening on platforms and in the news.
Okay, I'll start. Thanks, Shannon. So what should we demand? We should have a laundry list of things to demand. I can speak primarily from the journalism side, and I think the first thing that we should demand is a public counting of the role that news media outlets have played in leading us to this moment. So assessments of the coverage that they have given, and critical assessments that consider power relationships and how power works in this country. What do we get as a result of you not naming what exists, what we can all observe, what we have seen, what we've experienced? You won't call it, and I bring up the point of racism because it took until 2019 for the AP style book. We're all familiar with the AP style book here, right? Yes, yeah, yes. J school students, yes. To add a definition, an entry for races and racism, 2019. Which means until that point, journalists did not have the shorthand that was sanctioned by what we call the journalist Bible to actually label such policies in this way. Now, I don't expect journalists to be legal experts and thus analyze what treason is, but we can all read. And editors can get together in meetings and say, what words do we use to talk about this problem? When we dance around the coverage, when we're not explicit, when we have covered this as though it's an everyday thing, when we're repeating quotes without discernment, thinking about what it means for us to amplify these things that are said, that are incendiary, that are unlawful, that are unconstitutional, there needs to be an accounting for that. And every news organization across this country needs to do this accounting. Second to that, there needs to be policies put in place and upheld in the face of threats from profit motives, from being able to fund your operations, that actually address the issues of erasure and marginalization that have characterized journalism in this country since its inception. We had a lot of folks kneeling and offering apologies and renaming things and creating roles that 68% of which, more than 68% of which, created in 2019 and 2020 no longer exist in news media, doing all of these things that no one asked for, but not making actual structural change. And that's where we get back to this idea that we cannot rely on goodwill. Goodwill is not enough. It has to be a commitment. It has to be incentivized at a number of different levels. One of the incentives that we proposed with a group that I worked with on diversity issues was asking the Pulitzer Prizes to include, as part of their consideration for what made good journalism, consideration of representation in terms of the organizations that were submitting their entries. Like, if you do not have a staff that reflects the composition of this country, if you're not willing to at least disclose the data about that so people know who's creating the news, then you should not be able to nominate yourself for a prize. You're not honest with the American people about the workers behind your work. How can we trust you to be honest about the work that you're doing? And then the third thing I think that we should demand is some policy, and policy that gets us toward funding mechanisms for different approaches to journalism. As much as I hate it, and I will leave it to people much smarter than me, the federal government and state governments are some of the largest mechanisms that we have for developing funding that supports actual public media. That's the reason that the CPB funding was pulled. So we need policies that are in place, if not at the federal level, then as backups at the state and local levels that support news media that's actually going to do the work of truth telling.
Yeah, plus one to all of that. And you mentioned policies, and I'm a policy girly at heart. And so I think on the platform side, obviously platform accountability is like completely changed these days, right? We used to be able to like boycott, and then all of a sudden, you could get a new policy as someone who was responsible for writing those new policies whenever there was a boycott, right? There used to be some sort of consumer advocacy campaigns that used to really work. And they don't necessarily work as much anymore. But I do think one thing I think about often is like things can be better. And we know that because they were better, right? Like there was literally a time where we had policies on the books and we had people in place. And I talk about 2019 and 2020, and I didn't realize that that was going to be the heyday of trust and safety, right? Like that was the greatest that it had been, right? And so I think right now what we need to demand is, again, more people and more policies. I think what's really interesting that I've been recognizing is that a lot of these AI companies now are using trust and safety as like a defense against product liability lawsuits, which I find to be like a very fascinating thing, because it's like, of course, like a way to carve out around Section 230 and all that fun stuff. But it seems to be that trust and safety people are recognizing, like, if we don't have this, then we're negligent, right? Like we know that we need to have at least something here so that people are not completely harming themselves. And so I think that's one of the things that we should be demanding for students. What should you all do? I say this often, but like if you're actually in these jobs, you're sitting there, if you see something, save a copy, step one. And two, recognize like the work that you're doing is the work of accountability, right? I didn't really recognize this until after I had gone through everything I'd gone through and was talking a little bit about my journey. And one of my former J school classmates tweeted actually and was like, I'm really happy to see you doing the work that we were trained to do. And I was like, what? We're in journalism school. Like, what does that really mean? It is absolutely the work of the accountability. It is the work you're saying, how did we get journalists and platform folks in the same boat, right? Like, how are we still in this fourth, fifth estate, like holding on to democracy in a way, but that is the reality of the systems that we have created, right? And so I would encourage you all to recognize the power. And again, I told you all this because you can't say that I didn't warn you, right? You can't say like, nobody told me what the job was going to be. I told you, right? So like, I want you all to, if you end up in these jobs, recognizing the power and the responsibility that you have in your hands, and recognizing in the Spider-Man sense, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right?
Right. That's great. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to be mindful. I'll ask more questions if other folks don't have them, but we're going to go a little bit past our original time because we started a little bit late because of the excitement in the session before. But I will turn it over to you all with questions, and I can come around with a microphone or you can be loud. You got it? Okay.
Hi. So my question is, how do you define when to specifically like name or label an event in journalism or news? Because you said they kind of were dancing around labeling January 6th. So for instance, sometimes labeling an event can cause hysteria or mass fear or rouse specific groups to do harmful actions or activities. So are there times where not labeling an event could actually be the right decision?
That's a great question. So the easy out to the first part of your question is that, and my students will be familiar with this, it depends, right? It depends on what the situation is, what knowledge we have of it, how we can use the facts and the law and verifiable information to support the label that we need to assign to something. So it is still the same process of journalism that helps us understand what is a story. We can point to specific values that help us assess that this isn't just, something that happened that is of interest. This is an occurrence that is going to have an impact on multiple people on different levels of society. And so we do need to pay attention to it. So it sort of picks up on the end of our processes for thinking about the 5 W's and an H, and thinking about our news values ranging from conflict to prominence and beyond, right? I would add this value of discernment and exercising judgment about what it means to call something by its name when we have documentable facts that other people can also access, the public can access, and thus come to the same conclusion, where we can stand on our argument and say, we made this decision based on this information.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this in the labeling sense that I was talking about, in labeling content, right? And having to make those sort of decisions, having to say like, okay, here's something that we have decided is against our policies, but for whatever reason, we're going to leave this on the platform. We had guidelines that we used to decide that, right? Like we had policies that said, this is exactly what is not allowed. Here are examples of what we mean when we say that. And we had to check off all of those boxes. And once we said like, okay, well, we have all of these facts that recognize that this thing is against our rules, and we have gone through all of these guidelines, we can now say, let's label this thing, right? So I think along with what Meredith is saying is that discernment. I think we talk a lot in like journalism school about like your gut, but like I think it really means something, right? That thing that like you're genuinely trained to be able to say and think like, something's off here, right? Like keep asking those questions. And when you realize like, and you're feeling like, okay, like I'm satisfied with this and it feels okay. Like, again, that's the training that you're receiving.
I think I've been thinking that there's like an example that I think speaks like sort of directly to this, and it's not necessarily about labeling, but like how you can in some ways label or name like through reporting, right? Through like witnessing it yourself. Y'all know what's going on in the news, right? But there's sort of this back and forth between governors in Oregon and in Illinois. And the president, right? And the president's trying to send in troops and right? And so much of the reporting that I've seen from the press says, well, the president says these are war zones and it's violent and this is happening. And the governors say, well, it's not happening. Okay, and then that's irresponsible, right? Then we're being left to like, okay, then we as readers or listeners make that call ourselves based on sort of these two diverging views. But like, you can go there, right? And see what's happening, and what looks violent or is not. Like there are clear definitions for that, and you can count how many people are there. And even to your point, like you can feel if it feels like an unsafe place, right, or not. And so I think like sometimes the not labeling happens because it's hard, and sometimes the not labeling happens because of like traditions of sourcing, and because it's really, there's a sort of, there's not a lot of resources, right, to necessarily go be there all the time. But I think it's incumbent upon the press to try and do that, because then it's not labeling, it's just reporting. And it's like, here's for yourself, right, like what is happening.
Okay, I totally realized the last session ended late. So why don't we do like 2 more questions and then we can mill around whatever.
there is a student.
I see Dan and you, so you're both not.
Although I'm going to say the student should ask questions.
Just go, Dan. You got it.
So I really loved how you all phrased all of this in a very nuanced way. But let me take you to another front, which concerns me about the First Amendment and freedom in this country. And I'll mention very quickly. First is all the big media entities like CBS and ABC, which were supposed to protect the First Amendment and other things. They have really bowed down to the president. The second thing I wanted to tell you, not in essentially any order, just last week, Gallup released the media trust figures, and they are at a new low of 28%. The first time in 52 years, as you know, Gallup has been analyzing it, and during the Watergate, it was 75. 5 years ago, it was 41%. So media trust. And last but not the least, this summer, Reuters Institute at Oxford University, for the first time in their 12-year history of the digital media report, said that Americans were not getting their news from these traditional media platforms that we are talking about. They're getting it from social media, which, as you know, is drawing upon all of the traditional media sources. Social media in its own reality doesn't create that news. So I'm really concerned, and I don't want to be the doomsayer. I mean, in journalism school, we are doing great things, but I wanted to see what your perspectives are on and what's at stake. Thank you.
I'll just say one thing that I think, particularly your point about like what we might in the studies of democracy and not democracy, like authoritarians will call, like basically we're having this like a soft media capture, right? It's not actually the government or like storming into the offices and taking over, but these capitulations, these demanding of things, the paying of basically bribes, right, is a form of media capture. But to the question about trust, we've just spent some time talking about some problems. And like, I have to say, so we asked this question about trust, and I think we don't often ask a follow-up question when we do this sort of polling. And I think there's a lot of different reasons why you might mistrust the media. Like, from my perspective, as a person who works in a journalism school, I think there's a lot of good reasons that myself and many other people, I don't have a lot of trust in the media, right? In like the mainstream press and performing their role as the fourth estate and upholding democracy, because they're doing a very bad job at it, right? So if you ask me that question, if I'm taking the Gallup poll, I'm gonna say like, no, I don't have a lot of trust in the media. That doesn't mean I don't believe we should have one, right? And that we shouldn't fight for a better one. But I think these, in a J school, especially, I think these figures about media trust get bandied about, and I think they're important, right? But I don't think we're asking enough questions about it. And I don't think we're combining those ideas about the loss of trust with the real failures of the press, especially in this assault on our democracy, to play the important role that they are supposed to play, and that they are given not only the right, but the responsibility to play through the First Amendment. And I think that is what's at stake. And I had every buzzword of this panel in that answer.
Nailed it.
I would just go back to profit motives. Again, the reason that ABC, Paramount, other outlets have capitulated to this government and to its pressures are because someone somewhere, probably a team of someone somewhere within their organizations, did the math and found that it would save them money to go ahead and pay out rather than to fight the legal battle. That by all accounts, experts at places like Knight's First Amendment Center and other clinics have said these were very winnable lawsuits. And this is why I go back to history to say, let's pay attention to how this technique worked before. The case that is at the center of our contemporary understanding of the First Amendment and the responsibilities and freedoms that it confers to the press, New York Times versus Sullivan, was at the center of the civil rights movement, where news organizations and segregationists, I should say, took as their primary strategy to silence the news media lawsuits about the coverage of the civil rights movement and what was happening across the South. In order to shut up the New York Times, CBS, ABC, NBC, their local newspapers. They sued the living daylights out of them, and sued to an extent that we got this case before the Supreme Court, and the court decided that it was okay for us to be critical specifically of our elected officials. So they have been empowered with this technique, but because it saves money and it allows multimillionaires to keep making money, not the people down at the bottom where the jobs get cut when they want to cut the budget, but the folks up at the top to keep that money coming in, they back away from both that right and that responsibility.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing about people not getting their news from traditional media, which I'll just say, I think that's been happening for a lot longer than we want to like admit. As like a person who used to get all of their news from Twitter back in the day and was a journalism student, right? I think it's been happening for a while. I think now it's just transitioned, right? Folks are not getting the news from Twitter anymore. They're getting it from TikTok or they're getting it from Twitch. And I want us to also be careful to like not judge the youth from where they're getting their news from when we were doing a lot of the same thing.
I'm gonna add one more thing to that. I'm so sorry, but it's something that Deb said, and I just want to amplify this point that the polling and the reporting and things like Pew say that more Americans are getting their news from other places. But all of those other places, those people are not going through and doing primary source research. Those people would not pass classes at UNC based on the sources for their research, because what they are doing is repackaging the news from news outlets where reporters have gone through the documents, to the interviews, to the sites to do the observations, to do the reporting that influencers and other intermediaries are able to take advantage of and then present to people in more digestible and accessible and often free ways. So it's not that people aren't paying attention to these traditional news outlets. It's that they're getting the information from them second, third, and fourth hand.
All right, we're at 4:10, maybe the last one. Who else? Does anyone else have a question? We'll bundle them together. Okay, awesome. Sorry, Dan, I'm going to go with the last question, and then we can sort of have a conversation because I think we have the room for a little bit before the next event.
Hi. How should young or new journalists try to balance policy truth and the risk of adding to the or amplifying harmful narratives via social media?
All of us are like looking at each other. I mean, fact checking, right? Like that's what it really comes down to, right? And I'm sure that y'all have a lot of curriculum and a lot of lessons and learn how to do it deeply, right? But I think that there is still I think the basics of journalism school that you learn are still so incredibly important, even in today's age, right? Like the ability to, again, have that gut instinct that's saying like, something feels a little funny here, right? Like, okay, no, I think I need to ask 3 more questions before I can say this, or like, let me double check that. Actually, let me triple check that. Let me get my 3 sources that have confirmed that this thing is actually true before I post it on social media, right? Like the very, very basics, I think still hold strong.
Yeah. And I think like, I don't think these are easy decisions, right? But I also think there are hard and important decisions to make about like, when has an elected official or another person with power said something fully untrue and harmful and hateful potentially, and like at what point do you need to, as a journalist, report on that, correct it, and at what point do you not, right? Like when do you not? And so that's amplifying on social media or not, but it's also, I think what we see sometimes amplified on social media can be important signals for us in the press, right? To say like, oh, this is something that's happening, or important signal to an econ, like, well, this is happening, as it relates to January 6th. But I think it's important to also check that, right? And like, is this tied to a larger movement? Is this tied to something a lot of people are believing in? Is this tied to a policy? Okay, then maybe, you know what I mean? There's a need to report on it. But there's probably not a need to report on every single inflammatory and untrue thing that folks in positions of power and public office hold, because I think that also serves to amplify a lot of that. I don't think it's easy to decide between those two things, but I think it's important to think about.
I would just say, like IRE says, the investigative reporters, I never can remember what the E is for, but have a document state of mind. Be able to document your research and show the public and be able to frame for them what the truth is. We have talked about fake news for a couple of years, but it occurs to me that the other phrase about news that came from the president, alternative facts, or came from Kellyanne Conway to be specific, alternative facts, hasn't had the same sticking power because folks know that there are not alternatives to facts. Like if I can present, the principle is the same in law as it is in journalism, the preponderance of evidence that I can give to you. Now, whether you interpret it correctly or not, that's up to you. But if I am a media maker and putting that out there, then I'm going to show you what documents, what history, what context you need to know that you can also find in order to uphold what a truth is and critique a policy and call it what it is.